we're still after this understanding of like who we are as ourselves. So we're in the knowledge reality now. We're in the self segment, and Locke we're gonna see in the end has like a lasting legacy. I mean, what he introduced, is still being bandied about today. There's issues with it. We'll talk about the problems with it, but nonetheless, let's get right in. Okay. So let me ask you this. Let's just start out with like a little conversation. So what are you, like 19, 20? Are you the same person now as you were when you were 10? No? Well then, like, what would be different? Like, you don't have to say you personally. What would be different between somebody now and, say, somebody when you're 10? What would be?
Their experiences.
All right, so you have more experiences and such, yeah?
Maturity.
Maturity. You hope on that one, right?
Beliefs.
Yeah, beliefs are different. All right. How would you be the same, though? I mean, if I showed you a picture of you when you were 10, you would say that's you, right? Okay, so it is kind of you. So how would you be, like, what makes you the same then? Of you and your 10-year-old self?
Your DNA is the same.
DNA, okay.
The person that you were when you were 10 is still technically a part of who you are now, just with some sort of alteration.
Okay. That's part of the problem, though. Like, what has been altered? And if we alter something, does that make you not you? Okay, so, a lot of this is known as, in a general sense, as individuation. Like, what makes you and I distinct from each other, and what is continuous within you that 10 years from now we can still say that's you. And people have been battling these theories for a long time. I studied medieval individuation once, and I mean, just the book on the various individuations was like 3 inches thick, like one of those Norton Anthology of Literature books, just on the Middle Ages. So people have always tried to get at this idea of like what makes you you, and what makes me me, and how can I still be me 10 years from now when I'm not the same person? So that's what Locke's driving at here. So we'll try to explain his theory a little bit. We'll walk through his arguments. And again, you got to like let it develop a little bit. And you can still critique it. That's perfectly fine. But he's kind of like walking through a few ideas. And when he starts to dismiss those ideas, then he's got to get to the point, well, okay, well, then what is it? And then he lives with that. And then we'll talk after that about, well, doesn't that leave us with a few problems, By the way, we'll see that this is a little distinct, but this is one of those foundational things that we often just skip over in our lives. Who is the human person? What are we? Everybody just kind of like glosses over it, figuring, well, everybody knows, right? You know who you are, I know who I am. But if we really had to lay out, like, what makes us human, what makes us distinct from other people, that gets a little tougher. Nonetheless, all right. So we're going to be talking about identity and difference. So the first one here, he considers, can it be like a material substance? In other words, you kind of hit that, Nicole, there's a DNA thing there, right? So, there's something that's material that we could say is the same thing. But this has problems. Now, he doesn't introduce this argument, but it's such a clear argument. Has anybody ever heard of the ship of Theseus? I think we were trying to think of that once before, and I can't remember the name precisely, right? So the idea is this, let's say that you have, and let me paraphrase it. This ship goes into port, and you have to replace the rotting boards and, the worn boards. And over the course, say, of just over a decade, you've replaced every last blessed thing on the ship. There's not one single thing on that ship that was there when it was first made. Then how is it the same ship? What is the actual element of continuity for all that? We might, we will still call it the same ship, right? But by virtue of what? He's not thinking that this is really the best way to do it. We might even kind of think about that about ourselves. I think, did anybody, like, you talked about severing a limb. Did anybody pick up on that in the reading? If we're going to say that, because, this was your 10-year-old body, and this is now your 20-year-old body, this is my body, then and now. Well, if we sever the hand, I wouldn't look over at the hand and say, well, that's me. What makes me me now is also in that hand. You know, we wouldn't think like that. I'm trying to think of what else he might come up with here. This is interesting as an aside, okay? We were talking within the last week about kinds, natural kinds and social kinds. I was listening to a podcast on the way here this morning, and they were talking about how even in physics, like they're wondering like what are their actual laws of physics? I mean, what do they really boil down to? And how do we know that they're stable over time? And how do we even know, like if we even talk about ourselves as living beings, you know, what makes us us? Like you could say the DNA and everything, but do you know how much bacteria and such is necessary for us? It's living off of us as hosts, you know? Is that us? You know, all those digestive, I mean, you know, at what point do we say that's not us? They were talking about, like, in evolution, viruses, you know, they're not even quite sure what that is. Are viruses living things? They can't live without living things, so they can't exist on their own. They can only exist as a parasitical relation. What does that make them? They were talking about Pluto, and I want to find the planet. I want to find this T-shirt. My daughter showed it to me. It said it had Pluto, and it had the year it was discovered, and then the year that it was declared no longer a planet. And it's on the bottom. It said, you know, never forget, that kind of thing. You know, what makes it a planet, not a planet, right? I mean, is it the circular, you know, this particular spherical motion around the sun? Does it deviates from that? Is that why it got knocked off? Is it the size? You know, they were saying with like Jupiter, Jupiter can generate more energy than it actually takes in from the sun. So what makes the difference between a star and this? So, you know, we're always trying to figure out, we're still on that same idea about kinds here. We're trying to figure out, like, you know, what does that mean for us as humans? What does it mean to be humankind? It's on some level we can say, well, we all know. But when you start asking some hard questions, all of a sudden, we don't know where those edges are. Even being Homo sapien, you know, the evolutionary step prior to us, at what point was it no longer that? And was there a fuzzy area? You know, so he's trying to get at what if we're going to talk about, you know, continuity of the human person, and what is really like the seat of personhood or personal identity. You know, he's just starting this argument here, and he's saying it really can't be these material substances, because I can, first of all, if I've severed a hand, that hand no longer contains any level of what I would consider to be me. So it's not just the part. Plus, you can almost understand that this can be replaced over time. I mean, especially in, you know, that ship analogy. So in essence, there's not a single nail, not a single board that was there when it was first, you know, sent off the dock, but yet we all call it the same ship. He says, so I don't really think it could be material substances per se. Well, how about living substances? Now, did you pick up this analogy of the cobbler and the prince? You know, let's say that there's, you know, we'll call it like a rational soul, just to make it easy. So you could almost hear like Descartes in this, right? Like for Descartes, the human person was that rational thinking substance, right? And that in itself was something that he knew this was the human person. Well, what would we do if you could take whatever it is, that sense of living substance, and switch it? If we had a cobbler and if we had a prince, and they each have all their respectable duties and, you know, authorities, and we simply took the living substance of the prince and put it in the cobbler, and the living substance of the cobbler and put it into the prince. Now, which one's the prince and which one's the cobbler? Did anybody see Freaky Friday? I mean, it comes up, and anybody who ever talks about it, it always brings up Freaky Friday. So, you know, if you remember at least the remake with Lindsay Lohan, there was an earlier one, but with her, I remember, who was the mother? It was, she was from,
Jane Lynch.
what was it?
Jane Lynch.
Yeah. No, I don't think. Maybe there was one of that. Jamie Lee Curtis. That's the one I'm thinking of anyway, right? So now that she's the young girl, she started to eat French fries, right? Because it's not going to hurt my body, it's going to hurt your body, and she's been dying to eat these. So the girl she is the mother. I mean, so if you were going to accept this version of personal identity, then the Freaky Friday would be it. The minute that they took that living substance out of the mother and put it into the daughter, it's the daughter's body, but that's the mother. So even the mother's body, where the daughter was living in it, had to listen to the mother, even though they were separate bodies. So it's the thing with the prince and the cobbler. Would then the prince, who has all the authority in the kingdom, would he now be able to do that under the guise of the cobbler? He says that really doesn't make much sense. So, he says if it's not going to be the material thing, and he doesn't quite think that it can simply be the immaterial thing here too, because he said nobody. Now, there have been a lot of thought experiments that have come off of this, a lot, right? And some people have tried to make an argument that that's not too bad. Why can't it be a Freaky Friday thing? Because that really is the person. It kind of made sense. I mean, if that happened to us, and he said, well, so this one thought experiment was, well, if you can take like two people and you're going to switch, and you get to choose which one of those people gets $1 million or which one of those people gets a lifetime of electrical shocks, you're going to choose wherever you move into. So you're almost going to think, well, wouldn't that make sense? Because if I were the prince who became the cobbler, I would now try to do something to protect the cobbler's body because that's really me within there. So some people are saying this kind of makes sense, but he's saying no. He said that really doesn't, because we wouldn't look at those people. Like if we saw a picture of you when you're 10, even though you looked younger, we'd say, well, that's you. But if you were able to switch bodies, nobody's going to look at that and say, well, yeah, that's you too. So he's thinking, no, it can't really be this either, all right? And then this is sort of like a combination of the thing, right? So just think of like a soul, transmutating from one to another. Now, this isn't just a switch. This is almost, think of like Platonic recollection. So you have a pre-existence of the soul, and then the soul goes into a new body, and then when that body dies, the soul continues into another body. Which one of those is the person? And were they all those persons? So if you're going to make the soul there, and he even say too, like I think he talked about final judgment, okay, in a Christian context. If that soul transmutated through all these bodies, which one's going to stand for what's been done? Who do you hold accountable for that? Okay, so he kind of dismisses this immaterial substance too, and he says, really, it can't really be any of those things. I don't know. What do you think so far? Do you think like he's off a little bit? Do you think that one of those aren't a half bad argument? I don't know. What do you think? It's really just opinion. All right, I'll let you think about it. We'll move on. All right. So what he wants to do is, he says there's two things we're going to have to ask. We're going to have to ask, what provides a necessary relation for this thing to have a continuity? And he says one of those may be necessary, but he doesn't think it's sufficient. He wants it to be both things. Not only is it necessary, but it's going to be sufficient. So he wants to see, like, how is this going to work over, time? It's one thing to say that this, idea of the soul is the person. That might be something that's necessary, but it doesn't quite seem to fit the second category of sufficiency. And if he tries to find something that might fit the category of sufficiency, he's thinking it might not be necessary. And that would be like the body, right? Like the body might be something sufficient, but it doesn't quite seem necessary because we could lose a part of the body, and we're still not going to say that severed hand is us, right? So he's driving at something else, and he's thinking, these three things got to go. It really has to be something else per se. So for him, it's going to be the conscious, right? Everything for Descartes, the human person resides as a consciousness, right? That's the being. So he works through this real quick. He says, like, if we're going to say that, that's Socrates, what do we mean by that when we say that's Socrates? He goes, are we really talking about that Socrates has the same numerical soul? Are we really talking about it's the same animal? Are we really talking about that it's the same immaterial soul united to the same animal? Which that third one is probably, at least in our culture, more traditional to understand, right, as a combination of individuation. But he's saying this doesn't quite make sense. So it's clever, at least how he thought about it. He said, what connects you to your 10-year-old self, and some of you hit on it, are these concepts and these memories that you have. Right? I mean, nobody else has the same memories that you do. And that's kind of always weird. I don't know if you've ever, I don't want to sound macabre, but I don't know if you've ever been with somebody as they're dying. I don't know why, but it pops into my head that what's being lost are things that you'll never get from a book. And if your parents have passed, you might, I'm sorry for that. If they haven't, that's something like, me who's lost both parents, you think back on, gee, I should have asked this. Why didn't I spend more time? Like my mother told me about this. My mother was the youngest of 12, and I was the youngest of her, so there's quite a distance between me and my grandparents. But she had said, you think people are going to live forever, so you don't bother sitting down and asking questions. What about this? Tell me how to make this. You figure, I'll always ask them in a year from now, and then before you know it, the person's no longer there. So there's that idea of that identity that's all attached to all of those memories and experiences that the individual has. And he's calling that the consciousness of the individual. He's really talking about personal identity, personhood. I mean, we'll have to just use his language and not try to beat it up too much, right? So he's thinking that's it. It's like, you're able to represent the past. So you and you alone can really talk about what it was like to be you when you were 10, all right? And there's nothing else there besides that can really bring you to that level. So he says it's a collection of things. It's all the thoughts and actions that made you you. It's one of these things, and there's something to this, right? I mean, even if you did try to discredit him or disagree, you often hear, like, what's a saying I heard once that, like, we all complain about our own troubles in life, and we all have troubles in life. If we all, like in this room, if we took all of the most troubling things in our life and we put them in a pile, and then we were told we have to take back so many, we'd probably take back the ones we put there. Because we would hate to think, we know that if something changed there, it could change us. Here's a good one. Did anybody see the butterfly effect? Did you see that? It's with Alan Kush. How do you say his name? Kushner? The guy, he's from the '70s show. Yeah. Alan Kush. Okay. So what happens is they don't work out how he gets this power, but his dad inherited it. Where through writing, like journaling, he can journal a fictional story and rewrite history, and then he winds up getting these nosebleeds and these headaches, and then poof, he goes back, and everything has changed. And the whole idea is the butterfly effect is the idea that the wings of a butterfly thousands of miles away can really affect the currents and everything's connected. That's the idea, right? So like in this fictional story, when he's young, he's really good friends with this young girl, and they have a couple friends, and they decide to blow up this mailbox as a joke. But you saw it, but a mother and her child happened to be near it. And it messed them all up. The one kid became a real sadist. The other one was getting abused by her father. And it goofed them all up. So he winds up rewriting it. Every time he would rewrite his story and go back, he would have to try to figure out what's going on. Everything was different. And if I remember right, you have to help me remember, at one point he was a quadriplegic, or a paraplegic at least.
Something like that.
But that was the best scenario for everybody else, so he had to make a decision, would I stay like this? But the point is that, it changed everybody. So, in that story, it fits right in with this, where the collective experiences and the thoughts in everybody, this forms who we are. This is our identity. This is who we are as persons, and that only really resides in the conscience of the individual. It's not something, the consciousness, it's not something that you can transfer. It's not material, and it's not just in the soul. He's differentiating that, right? He's actually working his language a little difference here. He's going to make a distinction between like a human and person. So it's almost like he can, in one side, say, well, you're the same human in both the situations, but you're not the same person. So you have to almost, I'll use the term personhood, but you almost have to think in terms of personal identity. It's really how he's thinking it. But nonetheless. So that's what really does it. Now, let me see if there's anything else there. So that's his definition. Now, let me ask you, what do you think about that? What do you think about him capturing the essential essence of who you and I are in our consciousness, the collection of our thoughts and our memories, all our past experiences. That's interesting. I mean, on certain levels, it's interesting. There's going to be issues with it, you know. I mean, there's issues with everything. I mean, nobody has a fail-proof understanding, right? And there's nothing here we can weigh out and figure if it's true or not. It's got to all be done in the terms of arguments or such. Well, let's just see. I already said that he disconnects this. What do you think, though? I mean, can you have a personality without a consciousness? And therefore a consciousness without a personality? Some people have said he's a little circular here. What do you think about that? He has some objections. He does, you know, present objections himself, but nonetheless. Like, for instance, you know, it's almost like asking what comes first, truth or knowledge. We'd have to say, well, without knowledge I can't know truth, but without truth there's no knowledge to be had. You get yourself sort of caught, and you have to try to figure out, like, how does this all work? Here's an issue, and I think he does something with this, but there's plenty of thought experiments. Let's say that when you were 10 you did something. Okay, I don't know. I know he worked something out like this, but we're going to rework it. Let's say that when you were 10, you know, you locked your brother or sister in a room, and your parents found out, and I don't know if you were my age, you'd have got whacked. I know you can't do that today. So, but let's say that because it makes it easier, right? You got slapped upside the head, all right? Now, that'll happen when you're 10. That was your experience, and that's your thoughts. So you did something that you shouldn't have done, and your mom slapped you. So now when you're 20, let's go a little farther. You're 25, and you just got out of law school, right? So now you're out of law school, you have full memories of actually, you know, goofing around and locking your brother or sister in the room, but you have zero recollection of getting slapped. Now when you start to get like 35 or 40, you have some memories that you had when you were 20 or 25, but not the same memories you had when you were, say, 10. What happens if you start to have memory lapses? How does this work? What do you think about that? Or do you think there's another way for him to solve that? That's one of the arguments against him.
I feel like some of the most important memories that like actually contribute to your human consciousness and you're not actually going to forget. Like it's going to be like the little details, but those aren't really going to affect you as a person per se.
That's a good way. They're not as essential as other things.
And what would people say about the subconscious?
Well, that's okay. That's another thing too. You know, I mean, this is way before Freud, right? So, what about those things that make us do things and we don't know, right? There's issues about what. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something?
Yeah, there are science research shows that people may like create memories that we don't actually have. So what about that?
Yeah. What about that? And how about the fact, you know, let's just play off of that. How bad in psychology is our memory? You know, sometimes we get convinced of things that we've done and we didn't do. Or if they create memories, are they actually creating our person? Now, I wonder how he would respond to that. What do you think? Do you think he would say, well, but that doesn't matter if the memory's real or not? I wonder. Does it matter if the memory's real or not? It still made you who you are as a person.
Maybe he will say it matters like how we will create those memories. There must be some experience and past events influence us to think in that way. So that's our personality.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be a way to do it. Yeah, a lot of this. By the way, this is, you know, we'll say it at the end, this is one of his legacies, is, you know, this is what's known as the psychological continuity argument for human personhood. That's still bandied about through, you know, throughout the sciences today. And he brought this to the fore.
But I would like mainly agree with his like what he overall says, just because like I would think that I would be a completely different person if I was like raised in a different family. Like I don't think that's like pre-decided or like I know I'm gonna be like I'm who I am because of what I've been through, not like because I was going to be like that the entire time I was born. So like I like probably think a certain way now because of like the way I've grown up, other than like if I lived like across the country or somewhere else, like in the world, I may think like differently, like I don't know.
All right, good, yeah. You're gonna know?
I was gonna say, this is like what you meant sort of by like the drunk punching example, like, they're not
Say that
conscious,
again?
like the drunkenness when you're being punched.
Yeah, he brought that up, right? I mean, that was one of his critiques.
They're not conscious, like, I thought that was so interesting, cause like, I don't know, you wouldn't like connect that to like, Locke, I don't know.
Yeah, you know, you even think like in our civil law, all that doesn't excuse you from a particular crime, but it mitigates it, right? They realize that we talked that the person's not in the right mind when they did it, but you might have no recollection of the experience, you know, whatsoever.
I think the 65-year-old self can still be the same as the five-year-old self, because when you are 25, you can remember everything you did when you was 5-year-old. So when you are 65, you can remember everything you did at 25. So in a sense, they can connect.
There's a continuity there. Yeah, well, that's what he'd be arguing, the psychological continuity, you know. It's interesting, too, like my mother, when she was in her early 80s, you know, she talked about being with her mom and running through a field. And I said, how long ago does that seem? She said, it seems like it was 3 days ago, you know. And it's interesting, too, like, you know, like I think it's a little bit of the artistic and a little bit of the philosophical bend in me. It's like I always try to like absorb like the essence of what they're saying and think, what can I learn from it? So I learned from my mom was like where I live, there's like a hill goes down to my wife's shop, and I don't walk up the pavement because I think even old people can walk on pavement. I walk through the grass, or I walk up like through the hill parts, because I thought to myself, my mom said, you can't, when you get older, you don't do that, right? Because I mean, I know it sounds silly because you're so young and you're never going to be hurt, but right when you get older, you think you can't fall, you can't do that, don't. So it's like, you know, do all those things while you can, because you'll never be able to do those once your walking becomes unstable, you know. But then what do, you know, with somebody with dementia? I mean, do they, you know, because we even use language sometimes, right? Like they're no longer there. You know, we'll even use that type of language sometime. Do we just respect the fact that it's latent in there somewhere? You know, these things become very difficult for us to ferret out. You know, anytime, this is really such a foundational thing, because once you determine like what your understanding of the human person is and what the seat of the human person is, it has implications all across the ethical sphere. And people don't usually do that. They usually are very, you know, almost like spot zoning, right? Okay, let's talk about this, here's what I think here. Well, let's talk about this, here's what I think here. And somebody with a logical background will just show all the inconsistencies and what's going on there, right? I mean, there's something, like that's the one nice thing, like for those of you that are having other opportunities to take any philosophy courses, the reason why logic's so good is because you can't know everything about everything. It's impossible, right? There's just so much information. But you can, if you understand the foundations of an argument, you can get behind it. Like, okay, Richard Feynman. Everybody know who Richard Feynman is? The great physicist, Nobel Prize. Anybody know who Richard Feynman is? Okay. Great physicist, right? So one time he sort of mocked the philosophy of science. He's not a big fan of the humanities, right? And he says, the philosophy of science is about as useful to science as ornithology is to a bird. You know, like, who needs it, right? But interestingly enough, a philosopher listens to that and says, well, that's interesting, because I wonder what the relationship is between a person who studies physics and a person who's living. It's the same argument, right? So you didn't need to know you didn't really need to know squat about what the physics is. Have a good weekend, guys. You know, all you need to know was that there's something in that argument that's not sound, and you work through it. Let's see what else. All right, let me see what I was thinking here. I think I already kind of talked about this. If you have, like, let's just talk about 3 people, A, B, and C. You know, if person A has these experiences and thoughts and everything, and only parts of those are transferred when you're person B, or whatever age that is, and then even less so when you're person C, like you guys are kind of thinking. Well, then, you know, if A is B and B is C, you know, then just the law of transitivity said A's gotta be C, but we really couldn't say that in Locke's view, right? Now, let me just put this out there. You guys usually, you're getting the simplified arguments, you know, when I'm going over this. There'll be 30 people arguing over exactly what Locke meant, all right? In other words, there are advocates for him today who say, no, if you understand him correctly, he didn't fall into those traps. And there's other people that say that there's no way you can get out of those things. He's clearly stuck, you know? So I'm just want you to be introduced to him as a thinker and kind of get, you know, the basis of it. But what do you think about the transfer of consciousness? I mean, like when somebody is passing away, what if we were able to capture that? You know, this is like the idea, and we'll talk about this eventually, like the brain in a vat. I mean, could you take, you know, whatever is the essence of the human person, and can that be captured? And then who knows? I mean, we cryogenically freeze people now. I mean, you know, Walt Disney, if you ever heard the joke, you know, they're pulling a Walt Disney, it means they're frozen, right? Because he had enough money that he cryogenically froze himself, parts, so that somehow, maybe 5,000 years from now, who knows, we're going to have the technology to bring people back. And then they're going to have living history, right? We're going to see Walt Disney come back to life. Now that's an interesting thought experiment. Because that's almost a materialistic thing, right? That's saying that Walt Disney is in the body, but maybe they're counting on that to be a connection between the body and the spirit, that you really can, as long as you can keep one, you know, suspended, then the other one's kind of stuck in that zone, and we'll release it, you know, whenever that possibly could be. But what do you do with that? Or, you know, could we technically put this into another living substance? You know, I mean, could we, people who ascribe to reincarnation sort of have this, right? I mean, you could, maybe it's a lower animal depending on the karma that you played out in your life, or maybe it's a higher animal. So that it's not the substance, there's something else, you know, and that's interesting too, because, you know, you think about, I mean, you gotta love this Dalai Lama. When I saw him in an interview, and he has such a good sense of humor, and somebody asked him, you know, do you remember your previous life? Anybody want to know what he said? Do you know what, can you guess what he said? He said, I can't even really remember what I ate for breakfast. But that's interesting, right? So he's not denying that he's a reincarnated person, but he's almost has that Cartesian, you know, I'm sorry, that Platonic understanding that your memories don't survive the transition, right? That's why in Plato it's all theories of recollection. It's there, but it's got to be weeded back out, because there's something that happens when that soul comes back into the world that it loses all of that. Well, that's sort of like what the Dalai Lama was heading at there. But we can technically, if we're going to follow that, if we could figure out what that is, whatever the Dalai Lama claims was the person that was reincarnated, you know, if we can grab that, what will we do with it? Maybe it doesn't have to have a body. Maybe we can have like a, you know, like a glass globe or something, and if we can just figure out a way to give it, you know, some sort of, you know, voice, could we then pick up all the nights? Then think about that. You know, according to that theory, everybody that dies, we would never lose them. But that would be an interesting relationship. Now, understand, this is just his theory, right? I mean, other theories would be like, how do you separate the human person from biology? I mean, you just can't do that, right? Which is, you can almost hear like remnants of artificial intelligence in here. Like, what would it mean to give this thing consciousness? What would that even mean, right? The beginning and end of personhood, right? I mean, these conversations go on and on. You know, when, okay, if we know that, that we have a conception, you know, we have, you know, the sperm and the ovum come together, at what point then are we going to call personhood there? Where do you think we'd have to do it according to Locke's theory? Consciousness. And when do you think that would happen?
It's like a few months after birth.
Yeah, it's like 4 or 5 months, maybe up to 6 months.
What would you say about like the concept of like infantile amnesia then? Because technically you don't start forming memories of your experiences till like you're like 3 or 4. So how does that play into it?
Well, I don't know. That's an interesting thing. But, you know, that's also, you know, debatable. I was talking to somebody like, have you guys studied like much like psychoanalysis and such? Okay, so you're familiar with like Lacan or Catherine Malibu and such?
Not so much.
Okay, well they talk about these like, you know, these violent, in other words, you know, when they talk about instances in childhood, they're talking about the violence of being born, that type of thing. So somehow these things are there, these impressions are there. They may not be vivid, recollected memories, but they're still possibly there. What Locke would say, I don't know. It would be pure speculation, right? It'd be pure speculation. But if we just kept them at a surface level, you know, I think consciousness, and by that he'd have to almost start to talk about self-awareness, right? So I have no memories before I was 10. I have like maybe one. But when I was 10, I probably had memories of being 5. And when I was 3, I probably had memories of being 2, that kind of thing. So, you know, Peter Singer, the anaesthetist at Princeton University, he's all for termination of a non-person up until 5 or 6 months of age. Now that might, that's infanticide, that might like be gastful to somebody, but it's very, very consistent, isn't it? You know, it's a lot better than saying, well, when they're born, because that's a very arbitrary line. I know it's our legal line, but it's a very arbitrary line. But then what does this mean at the end of life too, right? It's like whatever your positions are at the beginning of all of this, you almost have to apply to the end of life, right? So like when I do nursing ethics and such, and I ask them just like questions, not being dogmatic, when does life begin? Well, it ends when you lose your heartbeat. Why doesn't it begin with you when you have a heartbeat? Is that what you want to go with? When is that, you know? Or it's when you start to sense pain or this or that. Well, you're down to about, you know, 6 weeks. Usually before anybody even knows they're pregnant, you know? So it's like, you almost have to like figure this out and then be consistent across the spectrum. You know, now, that being said, somebody has and will make the argument, but at the other end, you have a collection of memories that you don't necessarily have when you're, but now we have to talk about why are we placing a value on some memories over others, you know? I have no idea what Locke would think about that. I'm not a Lockean, you know, historian, so I'm not quite sure. But it's still interesting to think what they might do. But nonetheless, you know, if he's known for nothing less when it comes to personal identity, it's that psychological continuity, that we still have a sense that he's on to something here, right? I mean, there's something about the fact that we've have this, you know, sense of memories, and those are who we are. And like you said, it's really true if you grew up somewhere else, or if you were raised in a different way, or who knows, you had a different last name, things could have been a lot different, right? So all those things are important, but you'll have to figure out, you know, as we move through here, how do you separate that from your own biology then? You know, that kind of thing. So, what do you think? What do you think of Locke?